In November 1969, a lighthouse keeper named Thomas Marshall made a discovery that should have rewritten maritime history. Hidden beneath the floorboards of Whitefish Point Light Station, he found logbooks from over 100 ships that had vanished in Lake Superior across 5 decades. 3 days after reporting his find to the Coast Guard, Marshall disappeared from inside the locked lighthouse. The only trace he left behind was a message scrawled on the wall. "The lake keeps its own." Thomas Howell Marshall was 52 years old, with salt and pepper hair and hands scarred from decades of maintenance work on the light station's equipment. He'd been the head keeper at Whitefish Point for 11 years, and before that, he'd spent another 15 years working various lights around the Great Lakes. His wife Sarah had died of pneumonia 3 winters earlier, and since then, he'd thrown himself even deeper into his work, often staying at the lighthouse for weeks without relief. Marshall kept meticulous journals, not just the required logbooks, but personal notebooks, where he recorded everything from weather patterns to the migration habits of the birds that nested on the station grounds. His assistant keeper, 28-year-old Robert Kincaid, would later describe him as the most thorough man I ever met. Marshall could tell you the exact wind speed from any given storm over the past decade, or which ships had passed on any particular Tuesday in July. On the morning of November 18, 1969, Marshall was preparing for winter maintenance. The shipping season was winding down, and he needed to weatherproof the lighthouse before the brutal Superior storms arrived. He'd sent Kincaid to the mainland for supplies, heavy-duty caulk, new glass panes, and enough coffee to last through December. Therefore, Marshall was alone when he decided to replace some rotting floorboards in the lighthouse's storage room. The boards had been bothering him for months, creaking whenever he walked across them. He pried up the first plank around 9:30 a.m., expecting to find nothing but sand and old joists. Instead, he found a metal box. Inside that box were ship's logs, leather-bound, water-stained, but readable. The first one he opened belonged to the Edmund Fitzgerald. Not the famous one that would sink 6 years later, but an earlier vessel, by the same name that had vanished without a trace in 1883. The next log came from the Cypress, lost in 1907. Then the Bannockburn, which disappeared with all 21 souls aboard in 1902. But there were more boxes beneath the floor, many more. By noon, Marshall had pulled off half the storage room floor and retrieved 7 metal containers, each held between 12 and 18 logbooks, ships that had been listed as lost with all hands, no trace, for decades. Vessels whose disappearances had spawned legends about Lake Superior never giving up her dead. But here were their final entries, their captain's last words, hidden beneath a lighthouse that had stood watch over these waters since 1849. Marshall's own journal entry from that day survives. In his careful handwriting, he noted, "Found them at last. The answer to every question. God help me, I wish I hadn't." And so naturally, Marshall's first instinct was to report the discovery. But something made him hesitate. He spent the rest of November 18th reading through the logs, and what he found disturbed him. The final entries weren't what anyone would expect from ships in distress. There were no mentions of storms, no mechanical failures, no collisions. Instead, captain after captain wrote about the same phenomenon. They described a sound coming from beneath the water, a deep thrumming that seemed to rise from the lake bed itself. Several mentioned that their compasses had begun spinning wildly. The captain of the Bannockburn wrote, just hours before his ship vanished, "The water has turned black as pitch. Can see lights moving beneath the surface. Crew refuses to drop anchor. God preserve us from whatever rises tonight." But it was the last entry in each log that proved most unsettling. Every single one ended with the same phrase, written in different hands across different decades. "The lake is calling us home." Marshall tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of maritime tradition he'd never heard of, but then he found the manifest tucked inside one of the boxes, a type list of every ship whose logs were hidden here. At the bottom, someone had written in pencil, "THM will find these on November 18, 1969. THM will complete the pattern on November 21, 1969. THM Thomas Howell Marshall." His hands were shaking as he returned the logs to their boxes and replaced the floorboards. When Kincaid returned that evening with the supplies, he found Marshall pale and distracted. Tom looked like he'd seen his own ghost, Kincaid would later tell investigators. "Kept staring out at the lake and muttering about patterns." That night, Marshall placed a call to the Coast Guard station in Sault Ste. Marie. He reported finding historical documents of significant maritime importance, but refused to provide details over the radio. They agreed to send investigators on November 21st. Therefore, Marshall had 3 days to wait, and during those 3 days, strange things began happening at Whitefish Point Light Station. On November 19th, Kincaid woke to find Marshall standing at the gallery windows, watching the lake through binoculars, even though it was pitch black outside. When asked what he was looking for, Marshall only said, "The lights." "They're moving in patterns now." But Kincaid saw no lights on the water. What Marshall revealed next would haunt Kincaid for the rest of his life. The next morning, Marshall showed Kincaid one of the logbooks, specifically the entry from the captain of the Caliuga, lost in 1905. The captain described how his crew had begun acting strangely after they heard the thrumming sound. "First Mate Carlson insists he can understand it," the captain wrote. "Says it's not random noise but a language. Says the lake has been waiting for the right souls to complete its collection." Kincaid, a practical young man from Detroit, suggested they move the lobs to the mainland immediately. But Marshall refused. "They stay where they were meant to be found," he said. "I understand that now." What happened next would be confirmed by 3 separate witnesses on passing vessels. At 3:30 p.m. on November 20th, the lighthouse beam began operating on its own, in broad daylight. Not in its usual rotation, but in a complex pattern of long and short flashes. The freighter William Clay Ford logged the anomaly, noting that the pattern repeated every 17 minutes. But that wasn't even the strangest part. The captain of the Ford would later testify that he'd checked the pattern against Morse code, against every maritime signal he knew. It didn't match any of them. But when investigators compared it to shipping records, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. The pattern matched the exact times and dates when each of the missing ships had vanished. But the most terrifying revelation was yet to come. That evening, Kincaid confronted Marshall directly. He found the older man in the lamp room, writing in his journal by the light of the beacon. Marshall looked up with hollow eyes and said, "Robert, you need to leave. Take the boat to the mainland tonight." "Not without you," Kincaid replied. "I can't leave," Marshall gestured to the journal. "I've been chosen to complete the pattern. Every 20 years, the lake selects someone to document its collection. In 1949, it was James Strang. In 1929, it was William Carlyle. I found their names in the manifest. They were keepers here, too. They found the logs, and then they joined the collection." Kincaid tried to reason with him, but Marshall had already made up his mind. "The lake needs witnesses," he said. "Someone to record what it takes. That's why the logs were hidden here. Not lost, but preserved. Tomorrow, when the investigators come, they'll find my addition to the collection. And in 1989, another keeper will find them all again." But despite Kincaid's protests, Marshall locked himself in the lamp room that night. Kincaid tried to break down the door, but the lighthouse was built to withstand Superior's worst storms. All he could do was wait for dawn and help. When morning came on November 21st, the lamp room door stood open. Marshall was gone. On the wall, written in lamp oil, were the words, "The lake keeps its own." His personal journal lay open on the floor, the final entry still wet with ink. The Coast Guard investigators arrived at 10:30 a.m. to find Kincaid nearly hysterical. A massive search operation launched immediately, but the weather was against them. A November gale rose from nowhere, forcing rescue boats back to harbor. The storm lasted 3 days, and when it finally cleared, there was no trace of Thomas Howell Marshall. But the investigators did find the logs, exactly where Marshall's journal indicated. As they photographed and cataloged each one, they discovered that Marshall had added his own contribution to the collection. A detailed record of finding the logs, including sketches of the storage room and the exact location of each box. His account ended with a description of the sound that had begun rising from the lake on his final night. "It's not threatening, it's welcoming, like voices of old friends calling you home after a long journey. The lake doesn't take, it collects, it preserves. And now I understand why." The most unsettling discovery came when they found the manifest Marshall had mentioned. The typed list was there, with the penciled addition at the bottom. But beneath that, in Marshall's own handwriting, was a new entry, RJK. "We'll find these on November 21, 1989. RJK will complete the pattern on November 24, 1989. The Coast Guard seized all the documents and sealed the storage room. The logs were transferred to a secure facility in Washington, where they remain classified to this day. Officially, Thomas Howell Marshall was listed as missing, presumed drowned during the storm. The lighthouse was automated the following year, ending 20 years of manned operation. Robert Kincaid left lighthouse service immediately and moved back to Detroit. He never spoke publicly about what happened, but his daughter would later reveal that he'd forbidden his family from ever visiting the Great Lakes. He died in 1987, 2 years before the date written on the manifest. The Whitefish Point Light Station still stands today, converted into a museum. The storage room where Marshall found the logs is permanently locked, officially due to structural concerns. Tour guides are instructed never to discuss the Marshall disappearance, though locals still tell the story. In 1989, exactly 20 years after Marshall vanished, a maintenance worker named Richard James Keller, RJK, was hired to inspect the lighthouse. He quit after one day, leaving Michigan entirely. When tracked down by a documentary crew in 2009, he would only say, "Some things should stay buried. Some patterns shouldn't be completed." The Coast Guard has never released the contents of the ship logs, citing ongoing investigations. But mariners on Lake Superior still report strange occurrences near Whitefish Point. Compasses spin. Radios pick up transmissions that seem to come from nowhere. And sometimes, on calm November nights, sailors claim they can hear something rising from the deep, a thrumming sound that seems almost like language. The lake, they say, is still collecting. Thomas Marshall's body was never found. But then again, Lake Superior never gives up her dead. She keeps them. Just like Marshall wrote in his final entry, she preserves them. Perhaps, somewhere in those cold depths among the 100 ships whose logs he discovered, he finally found the answer to every question. Perhaps he even found Sarah again, the wife whose death had left him so alone in that lighthouse, now waiting for him in the lake's eternal collection. Perhaps he became part of it,